Hi everyone, welcome to one of the videos in this playlist looking at 10 of the key topics around about the grade B level that we think is going to be appearing in the Edexcel GCSE summer exam, and we're going to work our way through these topics to make sure that on top of mastering all the grade C stuff, you pick up most of these marks in your search for a grade B. Looking at the list there of the 10 topics, we're going to start here with the topic at the top, that's rearranging equations. So let's take a look at some typical GCSE style questions for this topic. Now, one thing to point out before we go any further, the question types that we're looking at in this short video are rearranging equations where the subject of the formula, and that language means the thing that you're trying to get on its own, only appears once in the equation that we start with. There are other types of rearranging equations where the subject appears twice, but we'll deal with those in a different video because they require a bit of extra work, including factorising. So let's take a look at this first question here, and the question says to us, make A the subject of the formulae. And that's maths language for get A by itself so that it can then be expressed in terms of everything else in the equation. So what we currently have here is A, and it's being squared multiplied by B, T's being added to all of that, and it's equal to Y plus R. So we're going to use the balancing method to try and manipulate this equation so that we end up with a position where A is all by itself in just a minute or so's time. The other thing that I'd like to do here is show you a technique that I find really useful in terms of supporting the bid mass of this equation, working out what happened to A in each order, but I'll also talk to you about how that can be a little bit dangerous in your GCSE to use it with other techniques. So, first thing I'm going to do here is over to the right hand side I'm going to use a flow diagram to talk about bid mass and what's happened to A so that I can hopefully unpick it in the right order. So A, as the value inside this equation that we want to get on its own, initially got squared to create A squared. A squared then got multiplied by B to give us this BA squared, and notice I'm just talking about the squared happening to A. If it was happening to all of it, BA, then that would be in brackets, and then BA squared had T added to it. So there's three things there that have happened to A, and once I've done all of that, it ends up equaling Y plus R. So my objective then is to, using inverse operations, undo all of these stages in bid mass that happened to A in this question. The reason why I've kind of set this over to the right hand side is I'm going to use it as a technique to help with my balancing. I'm not going to use it as the actual working out to this question, and I'm telling you that because in the mark scheme for the Edexcel GCSEs, this method known as the flow diagram method, if done correctly, can award full marks. But if there is any mistakes in it, then you'll end up getting nothing, whereas with the balancing method, you could pick up part marks for each of the correct levels of calculation you do in it. So we're going to use it over here as a guide, but our actual work is going to appear under here, and we're going to use the balancing method. So we start knowing that an equal sign in maths means everything on the left is worth the same as on the right. So in terms of a balancing method or a seesaw, we're in equilibrium. Everything on the left is equal to everything on the right, and we're going to try and unpick and undo all of these things on the left that are stopping A being the subject, and that means stopping A being on its own. So let's refer to our flow diagram to make sure we get rid of them in the right order. A got squared, then it got timesed by B, then T was added. So we need to undo those things in the opposite order. So the last thing that happened was add T, so we need to start by getting rid of T. And to get rid of T we do the inverse, so the inverse of add is subtract, so we're going to subtract T. But the concept of this balancing method is that we need to do that to both sides of the equation to keep the balance and to keep it in equilibrium. So my new equation is now going to say BA squared. The plus T and the minus T cancel each other out, so that's gone. And on the right hand side I've got Y plus R subtract T. And I'm still balanced because I've done the same thing to both sides, and therefore I can tick off undoing this bit if you like. Now what I need to get rid of is this multiply by B, because that was the next thing that happened in bid mass, and the inverse of multiply is to divide, so I'm going to divide by B. So on the left hand side divide by B, and on the right hand side divide by B. So on the left what we're left with is times by B, divide by B, cancel each other out, so I'm left with A squared. And on the right hand side I've got Y plus R subtract T, all divided by b. And I've written it that way because it's nice and simple to show what's happening in each of the stages. You could have written it as y plus r minus t divided by b, but if you'd done that, technically it's t being divided by b if you think about BIDMAS, so you would have needed to have put all of that in brackets. Okay, so either this version or this version mathematically now mean the same, but we're going to stick to this one over here, so let's just get rid of that before we think too much about it. And then finally, a's being squared, and the inverse operation of squared is to square root. So I'm going to square root the left-hand side, and I'm going to square root the right-hand side. And that will get me down to my final answer here. So the squared and the square root cancel each other out, so I'm left with a, and it's equal to the square root of y plus r minus t, all divided by b. A couple of things to note there that are really important in terms of picking up full marks on this topic in the exam. Firstly, you'll notice my square root sign covers all of the other parts of the equation, and it doesn't stop, for example, halfway up or halfway across, and that shows to the examiner that it's being done to all of the equation. If you don't draw that properly, you could lose a silly mark there. And notice, and I know this sounds obvious, but I see too many students forget this stage, I've made sure it says A equals, because if you just put this in the answer box, you actually don't have a subject of the formula, so make sure that it's equal to something, and preferably the thing that we're trying to make on its own. Okay, let's look at the second question. Follow the same technique, make sure we know what we're doing. I'll do this one in a different colour just so we don't confuse it with the working out that we've just done above that. So this one currently says m is equal to the square root of k plus 1 divided by 4, and it says make k the subject of the formula this time. So let's start with our flow diagram because that supports our understanding of what happened to k in what order. So the first thing that happened to k, if we have a look at the BIDMAS here and we have a look at the structure, is the add 1. K had 1 added to it. If you're looking at this and going, well, how do you know that the add 1 happened before, for example, the divide by 4? The divide by 4 is happening to k plus 1, not just to k, so the plus 1 has to have already happened. If you're looking at going, well, how come the square root didn't happen first? Well, the square root is happening to all of these parts of the term, so they all already have to have occurred. If it was just around the k, we could have said that that happened first. So k has plus 1 added to it, and then it's divided by 4, and then finally the square root is applied. So we've got 3 stages again that we're going to unpick in the opposite order. So I start with my m is equal to the square root of k plus 1 divided by 4. And the first thing I need to get rid of is the squared, and to do that the inverse operation, sorry, the square root, and the inverse operation is squared. So I'm going to square on this side and I'm going to square on this side. So I'm now left with m squared is equal to, the square root and the squared cancel each other out, so k plus 1 divided by 4. I now need to get rid of the divide by 4, and the inverse operation for that is times by 4. So I'm going to multiply on the left by 4, and I'm going to multiply on the right by 4. So I've now got 4m squared equals k plus 1. And then my last stage is to get rid of the plus 1, and the inverse operation for that is to subtract 1. So if I bring that up here just to tidy that up, I'm going to subtract 1 on this side, and I'm going to subtract 1 on this side. So I'm left with 4m squared subtract 1 is equal to k. And if anyone out there is thinking, well, how can that work because the k is on the wrong side? If you think about an equal sign and 2 sides to it, actually they're worth the same value, and even if we swap them over, a bit like a seesaw in a park I suppose, it wouldn't matter if you swapped ends with your friend, it would still create the same type of balance, or one being up in the air and one being down. So k is the subject of the formula and everything else is left on the left hand side. There's a final question at the bottom there, give it a go, make sure you can practice this key technique for a grade B,